Chapter 2. My Present Environment, Work, and Activities. While my environment differs in rather important respects from that of my readers, I can assure you, with ironic understatement, that it is as vapid, varied, and vital as physical existence. It is more pleasurable, though my ideas of pleasure have changed some since I was a physical being more rewarding and offering far greater opportunities for creative achievement. My present existence is the most challenging one that I have known, and I have known many, both physical and non-physical. There is not just one dimension in which non-physical consciousness resides any more than there is only one country on your planet or planet within your solar system. My environment now is not the one in which you will find yourself immediately after death. I cannot help speaking humorously, but you must die many times before you enter this particular plane of existence. Birth is much more of a shock than death. Sometimes when you die, you do not realize it, but birth almost always implies a sharp and sudden recognition. So there is no need to fear death. And I, who have died more times than I care to tell, write this book to tell you so. My work in this environment provides far more challenges than any of you know, and it also necessitates the manipulation of creative materials that are nearly beyond your present comprehension. I will say more of this shortly. First of all, you must understand that no objective reality exists but that which is created by consciousness. Consciousness always creates form, and not the other way around. So my environment is a reality of existence created by myself and others like me, and it represents the manifestation of our development. We do not use permanent structures. There is not a city or a town, for example, in which I dwell. I do not mean to imply that we are off in empty space. For one thing, we do not think of space as you do, and we form whatever particular images we want to surround us. They are created by our mental patterns, just as your own physical reality is created in perfect replica of your inner desires and thoughts. You think that objects exist independently of you, not realizing that they are instead the manifestation of your own psychological and psychic selves. We realize that we form our own reality, and therefore we do so with considerable joy and creative abandon. In my environment, you would be highly disoriented, for it would seem to you as if it lacked coherency. We are aware of the inner laws that govern all materializations. However, I can have it night or day in your terms as I prefer, or any period, say, of your history. These changing forms would in no way bother my associates, for they would take them as immediate clues as to my mood, feelings, and ideas. Permanency and stability basically have nothing to do with form, but with the integration of pleasure, purpose, accomplishment, and identity. I travel to many other levels of existence in order to fulfill my duties, which are primarily those of a teacher and educator, and I use whatever aids and techniques serve me best within those systems. In other words, I may teach the same lesson in many different ways, according to the abilities and assumptions that are inherent in any given system in which I must operate. I use one portion of myself from many personalities that are available to my identity in these communications and in this book. In other systems of reality, this particular Seth personality that I, the larger self identity adopt here, would not be understood. All systems of reality are not physically oriented, you see, and some are entirely unacquainted with physical form. Nor is sex, as you understand it, natural to them, I drink some water here. Therefore, I would not communicate as a male personality who has lived many physical existences, though this is a legitimate and valid portion of my identity. In my home environment, I assume whatever shape I please, and it may vary, and does, with the nature of my thoughts. You, however, form your own physical image at an unconscious level in more or less the same manner, but with some important differences. You usually do not realize that your physical body is created by you at each moment as a direct result of your inner conception of what you are, or that it changes in important chemical and electromagnetic ways with the ever-moving pace of your own thought. Having long ago recognized the dependence of form upon consciousness, we have simply been able to change our forms entirely so that they more faithfully follow each nuance of our inner experience. This ability to change form is an inherent characteristic of any consciousness. Only the degree of proficiency and actualization varies. You can see this in your own system, in a slowed-down version, when you observe the changing forms taken by living matter through its evolutionary history. Now, we can also take several forms at one time, so to speak, but you can also do this, although you do not generally realize it. Your physical form can lie sleeping and inert upon the bed, while your consciousness travels in a dream form to places quite distant. Simultaneously, you may create a thought form of yourself, identical in every respect, and this may appear in the room of a friend, quite without your conscious awareness. So consciousness is not limited as to the forms it can create at any given time. Practically speaking, we are rather more advanced along these lines than you, and when we create such forms, we do so with complete awareness. I share my field of existence with others who have more or less the same challenges to meet, the same overall pattern of development. Some I have known and others I have not. We communicate telepathically, but then again, telepathy is the basis for your language, without which their symbolisms would be meaningless. Because we do communicate in this manner, this does not necessarily mean that we use mental words, for we do not. We communicate instead through what I can only call thermal and electromagnetic images that are capable of supporting much more meaning in one sequence. The intensity of the communication is dependent upon the emotional intensity behind it, although the phrase emotional intensity may be misleading. We do feel an equivalent of what you call emotions, though these are not the love or hate or anger that you know. Your feelings can best be described as the three-dimensional materializations of far greater psychological events and experiences that are related to the inner senses. I will explain these inner senses to you later at the end of this chapter. Suffice it here to say that we have strong emotional experience, although it differs in a large measure from your own. It is far less limited, far more expansive in that we are also aware and responsive to the emotional climate as a whole. We are much freer to feel and experience because we are not so afraid of being swept away by feeling. Our identities do not feel threatened, for example, by the strong emotions of another. We are able to travel through emotions in a way that is not now natural to you, and to translate them into other facets of creativity than those with which you are familiar. We do not feel the need to conceal emotions, for we know it is basically impossible and undesirable. Within your system, they can appear troublesome because you have not yet learned how to use them. We are only now learning their full potential and the powers of creativity with which they are connected. Since we realize that our identity is not dependent upon form, therefore, of course, we do not fear changing it, knowing that we can adopt any form we desire. We do not know death in your terms. Our existence takes us into many other environments, and we blend into these. We follow what rules of form exist within these environments. All of us here are teachers, and we therefore adapt our methods also, so that they will make sense to personalities with varying ideas of reality. Consciousness is not dependent upon form, as I have said, and yet it always seeks to create form. We do not exist in any time framework as you know it. Minutes, hours, or years have lost both their meaning and their fascination. We are quite aware of the time situation within other systems, however, and we must take them into account in our communications. Otherwise, what we say would not be understood. There are no real barriers to separate the systems of which I speak. The only separation is brought about by the varying abilities of personalities to perceive and manipulate. You exist in the midst of many other systems of reality, for example, but you do not perceive them. And even when some event intrudes from these systems into your own three-dimensional existence, you are not able to interpret it, for it is distorted by the very fact of entry. I told you that we do not experience your time sequence. We travel through various intensities. Our work, development, and experience all takes place within what I term the moment point. Here within the moment point, the smallest thought is brought to fruition, the slightest possibility explored, the probabilities thoroughly examined. The least or the most forceful feeling entertained. It is difficult to explain this clearly, and yet the moment point is the framework within which we have our psychological experience. Within it, simultaneous actions follow freely through associative patterns. For example, pretend that I think of you, Joseph. In so doing, I immediately experience and fully your past, present, and future in your terms, and all of those strong or determining emotions and motivations that have ruled you. I can travel through those experiences with you if I choose. We can follow a consciousness through all of its forms, for example, and in your terms within the flicker of an eye. Now it takes study, development, and experience before an identity can learn to hold its own stability in the face of such constant stimuli. And many of us have gotten lost, even forgetting who we were, until we once more awaken to ourselves. Much of this is quite automatic to us now. In the infinite varieties of consciousness, we are still aware of a small percentage of the entire banks of personalities that exist. For our vacations, we visit amid quite simple life forms and blend with them. To this extent, we indulge in relaxation and sleep, for we can spend a century as a tree or as an uncomplicated life form in another reality. We delight our consciousness with the enjoyment of simple existence. We may create, you see, the forest in which we grow. Usually, however, we are highly active, our full energies focused in our work and in new challenges. We can form from ourselves, from our own psychological entireties, other personalities whenever we wish. These, however, must then develop according to their own merit, using the creative abilities inherent in them. They are free to go their own way. We do not do this lightly, however. Each reader is a portion of his or her own entity, and is developing toward the same kind of existence that I know. In childhood and in the dream state, each personality is aware to some extent of the true freedom that belongs to its own inner consciousness. These abilities of which I speak, therefore, are inherent characteristics of consciousness as a whole and of each personality. My environment, as I told you, changes constantly, but then so does your own. You rationalize away quite legitimate intuitive perception at such times. For example, if a room suddenly appears small and cramped to you, you take it for granted that this change of dimension is imaginative, and that the room has not changed regardless of your feelings. The fact is that the room under such conditions will have changed quite definitely, and in very major respects, even though the physical dimensions will still measure the same. The entire psychological impact of the room will have altered. Its effect will be felt by others beside yourself. It will attract certain kinds of events rather than others, and it will alter your own psychological structure and hormonal output. You will react to the altered state of the room even in quite physical ways, through its width or length in inches or feet may not seem to vary. I told our good friend Joseph to underline the word seem, because your instruments would show no physical alteration, since the instruments within such a room would themselves have already altered to the same degree. You are constantly changing the form, the shape, the contour, and the meaning of your physical body and most intimate environment, although you do your best to ignore these constant alterations. On the other hand, we allow them full reign, knowing that we are motivated by an inner stability that can well afford spontaneity and creation, and realizing that spiritual and psychological identity are dependent upon creative change. Our environment, therefore, is composed of exquisite imbalances where change is allowed full play. Your own time structure misleads you into your ideas of the relative permanency of physical matter, and you close your eyes to the constant alterations within it. Your physical senses confine you as best they can to the perceptions of a highly formalized reality. Only through the use of the intuitions and in sleep and dream states, as a rule, can you perceive the joyfully changing nature of your own and any consciousness. One of my duties is to enlighten you on such matters. We must use concepts that are at least fairly familiar to you. In doing so, we therefore use portions of our own personalities, with whom you can to some extent relate. There is no end to our environment. In your terms, there would be no lack of space or time in which to operate. Now, this would put tremendous pressure on any consciousness without proper background and development. We do not have one simple, cozy universe in which to hide. We are still alert to other quite alien systems of reality that flash on the very outskirts of consciousness as we know it. There are far more various kinds of consciousness than there are physical forms, each with its own pattern of perception, dwelling within its own camouflage system. Yet all of these have inner knowledge of the reality that exists within all camouflage and that composes any reality by whatever name it is called. Now, many of these freedoms are quite natural to you in the dream state, and you form dream environments often to exercise such potentials. Later I will have at least some remarks to make concerning the ways that you can learn to recognize your own feats, to compare them with your proficiency in daily physical life. You can learn to change your physical environment, therefore, by learning to change and manipulate your dream environment. You can also suggest specific dreams in which a desired change is seen, and under certain conditions, these will then appear in your physical reality. Now, often you do this without realizing it. Whole consciousness adopts various forms. It need not always be within a form. All forms are not physical ones. Some personalities, therefore, have never been physical. They have evolved along different lines, and their psychological structures would be alien to your own. To some extent, I also travel through such environments. Consciousness must show itself, however. It cannot unbe. It is not physical. It must therefore show its activation in other ways. In some systems, for example, it forms highly integrated mathematical and musical patterns that are themselves stimuli for other universal systems. I am not very well acquainted with these, however, and cannot speak of them with any great familiarity. If my environment is not a permanently structured one, then, as I have told you, neither is your own. If I am aware of communicating now through Rupert in different ways, each of you telepathically communicates to and through other personalities, though with little knowledge of your accomplishment. The senses that you use in a very real manner create the environments that you perceive. Your physical senses necessitate the perception of a three-dimensional reality. Consciousness is equipped with inner perceptors, however. These are inherent within all consciousness, regardless of its development. These perceptors operate quite independently from those that might be assumed when a given consciousness adopts a specialized form, such as a physical body, in order to operate in a particular system. Each reader, therefore, had inner senses and to some extent used them constantly, though he is not aware of doing so at an egotistical level. Now we use the inner senses quite freely and consciously. If you were to do so, then you would perceive the same kind of environment in which I have my existence. You would see an uncamouflaged situation in which events and form were free and not stuck in a jelly-like mold of time. You could see, for example, your present living room not only as a conglomeration of permanent appearing furniture, but switch your focus and see the immense and constant dance of molecules and other particles that compose the various objects. You could see a phosphorescent-like glow, the aura of electromagnetic structures that compose the molecules themselves. You could, if you wished, condense your consciousness until it was small enough to travel through a single molecule, and from the molecule's own whirl, look out and survey the universe of the room and the gigantic galaxy of interrelated, ever-moving, star-like shapes. Now, all of these possibilities represent a legitimate reality. Yours is no more legitimate than any other, but it is the only one that you perceive. Using the inner senses, we become conscious creators, co-creators, but you are unconscious co-creators, whether you know it or not. If our environment seems unstructured to you, it is only because you do not understand the true nature of order, which has nothing to do with permanent form, but only appears to have form from your perspective. There is no 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 9 o'clock in the evening in my environment. By this I mean that I am not restricted to a time sequence. There is nothing preventing me from experiencing such sequences if I choose. We experience time, or what you would call its equivalent nature, in terms of intensities of experience, a psychological time with its own peaks and valleys. This is somewhat similar to your own emotional feelings when time seems speeded up or slowed down, but it is vastly different in important ways. Our psychological time could be compared in terms of environment to the walls of a room, but in our case, the walls would be constantly changing in color, size, height, depth, and width. Our psychological structures are different, practically speaking, in that we consciously utilize a multidimensional psychological reality that you inherently possess but are unfamiliar with at an egotistical level. It is natural, then, that our environment would have multidimensional qualities that the physical senses would never perceive. Now, I project a portion of my reality as I dictate this book to an undifferentiated level between systems that is relatively clear of camouflage. It is an inactive area, comparatively speaking. If you were thinking in terms of physical reality, then this area could be likened to one immediately above the atmosphere of your Earth. However, I am speaking of a psychological and psychic atmospheres, and this area is sufficiently distant from Rupert's physically oriented self so that the communications can be relatively understood. It is also in a way distant from my own environment, for in my own environment I would have some difficulty in relating information in physically oriented terms. You must understand that by distance I do not refer to space. Creation and perception are far more intimately connected than any of your scientists realize. It is quite true that your physical senses create the reality that they perceive. A tree is something far different to a microbe, a bird, an insect, and a man who stands beneath it. I am not saying that the tree only appears to be different. It is different. You perceive its reality through one set of highly specialized senses. This does not mean that its reality exists in that form in any more basic way than it exists in the form perceived by the microbe, insect, or bird. You cannot perceive the quite valid reality of that tree in any context but your own. This applies to anything within the physical system that you know. It is not that physical reality is false. It is that the physical picture is simply one of an infinite number of ways of perceiving the various guises through which consciousness expresses itself. The physical senses force you to translate experience into physical perceptions. The inner senses open your range of perception, allow you to interpret experience in a far freer manner, and to create new forms and new channels through which you or any consciousness can know itself. Consciousness is, among other things, a spontaneous exercise in creativity. You are learning now, in a three-dimensional context, the ways in which your emotional and psychic existence can create varieties of physical form. You manipulate within the psychic environment, and these manipulations are then automatically impressed upon the physical mold. Now, our environment is in itself creative in a different manner than yours. Your environment is creative in that trees bear fruit, that there is a self-sustaining principle, that the earth feeds its own, for example. The naturally creative aspects are the materializations of the deepest psychic, spiritual, and physical inclination of the species, set up in your terms eons ago, and a part of the racial bank of psychic knowledge. We endow the elements of our environment with an even greater creativity that is difficult to explain. We do not have flowers that grow, for example, but the intensity, the condensed psychic strength of our psychological natures forms new dimensions of activity. If you paint a picture with three-dimensional existence, then the painting must be on a flat surface, merely hinting at the complete three-dimensional experience that you cannot insert into it. In our environment, however, we could actually create whatever dimensional effects we desired. All of these abilities are not ours alone. They are your inheritance. As you will see later in this book, you exercise your own inner senses and multidimensional abilities more frequently than it might seem in other states of consciousness than the normal waking one. Since my own environment does not have easily defined physical elements, you will be able to understand its nature by inference as I explain some related topics throughout this book. Your own physical environment appears as it does to you because of your own psychological structure. If you gained your sense of personal continuity through associative processes primarily, rather than as a result of the familiarity of self moving through time, then you would experience physical reality in an entirely different fashion. Objects from past and present could be perceived at once, their presence justified through associative connections. Say that your father throughout his lifetime has 8 favorite chairs. If your perceptive mechanisms were primarily set up as a result of intuitive associations rather than time sequence, then you would perceive all of these chairs at one time, or see in one you would be aware of the others. So environment is not a separate thing in itself, but the result of perceptive patterns, and these are determined by psychological structure. So if you want to know what my environment is like, you will have to understand what I am. In order to explain, I shall have to speak about the nature of consciousness in general. In doing so, I shall end up telling you much about yourself. The inner portions of your identity are already aware of much that I will tell you. Part of my purpose is to acquaint your egotistical self with knowledge that is already known to a larger portion of your own consciousness that you have long ignored. You look out into the physical universe and interpret reality according to the information received from your outer senses. I will stand, figuratively speaking, in physical reality and look inward for you and describe those realities of consciousness and experience that you are presently too fascinated to see. For you are fascinated with physical reality, and you are in as deep a trance now as the woman is through whom I write this book. All of your attention is focused in a highly specialized way upon one shining, bright point that you call reality. There are other realities all about you, but you ignore their existence, and you blot out all stimuli that come from them. There is a reason for such a trance, as you will discover, but little by little you must wake up. My purpose is to open your inner eyes. My environment includes, of course, those other personalities with whom I come in contact. Communication, perception, and environment can hardly be separated. Therefore, the kind of communication that is carried on by myself and my associates is extremely important in any discussion of our environment. In the following chapter, I hope to give you an ideal, quite simply, of our existence, the work in which we are involved, the dimension in which we exist, the purposes that we hold dear, and most of all, of those concerns that make up our experience.